Hello everyone, my name is Paul Andrew and welcome back to another YouTube video on creating a metadata-driven processing framework for Azure Data Factory and hopefully, as my subtitle suggests, in the very near future, Azure Synapse Analytics and their Orchestrate pipelines as well. In this video, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the features that have been added to the framework in version 1.9.2, which hopefully will be released very shortly this week. So let's dive in. So here we are in the GitHub repository. And what I'm going to direct you to firstly is just the README file, and that is currently looking at the wrong branch. So what we have here for version 1.9.2, as I say, is just a few features that's been added, and hopefully this video will just give you an overview of what they look like. So to kind of drive the agenda of the video, what I'm going to do is use my internal backlog of issues to help me keep track of those features and things. So the done column that I've got here in the project, which hopefully by the time you actually watch this will have all now been moved into the release column because I've done the pull request. But what I'll do is I'll use this list just to drive the agenda of this video first for you. So let's start with the first one, 78. Create a generic throw exception pipeline. So what this means to you is, and what you'll now find is, if you go into the data factory, your framework factory, you look at the pipelines and you look at the proc framework folder, what's now been added is this new subfolder beneath it where I've suffixed it with utils for utilities. So I'm going to use this maybe going forward and certainly for this release to put some of those other more generic boilerplate bits of code and things and activities that we want to just wrap up and reuse in other places. I think so far I've resisted doing this in the framework just to try and keep things tidy, but I've lost that battle with myself. So we now have these util pipelines to accompany the main framework pipelines as well. So for this first one, and of course what we're missing in Data Factory at the moment is the ability just to throw an exception if we want to as part of our other activities. So I've cheated slightly, and what I've done is I've used a lookup activity, and what I'm passing to this as a message, a pipeline parameter, and that pipeline parameter is going to the lookup, and I'm just using a T-SQL raise error condition, as you can see from this expression, just to throw an exception. Nothing too exciting about it. It's handy sometimes within the framework to control when the exceptions are being thrown. So that's all we have here with this pipeline, which, very exciting in debug mode. We get a failure. Of course, the pipeline fails, and then we get the failure details. Okay, it's wrapped up slightly with the T-SQL context of the metadata database I'm using to do the actual raise error, but ultimately we get the effect we want. We get a controllable way to throw an exception. So that's it for the first one, nothing too exciting. Next up is this idea of checking if a pipeline is actually running. Now, this was an idea that came from the community and feedback that I got on the framework, which was great feedback. And the simple requirement was that if at some point we were in here and we were going to trigger the parent pipeline, somebody, or maybe two users that weren't really aware of each other, could actually go and trigger the pipeline multiple times, which then could result obviously in some strange behavior in the metadata database. So what's been added, and I actually blogged about this separately if you're interested, to try and create it as more of a generic thing that you could use, is really just a way that Data Factory could check itself for a running pipeline, excuse me, using the Azure Management API. So that sort of generic thinking and development that was blogged about there has now been wrapped up into the framework in the form of this utils pipeline, again, along with our throw exceptions. And what we can do is we can trigger this, and let me cheat by copy and pasting. I'm just going to ask it to check if itself is running. And of course, if it is, it's going to throw an exception for me because we don't want it to already be running. There are circumstances where this is going to be allowed, as we'll talk about a bit later on in this release with our batch execution behavior. But for now, I'm just going to trigger that, and what we see here is the pipeline will go through. I won't describe all the activities, it's detailed in that blog post, but essentially getting information about the subscription, the resource group, checking that the pipeline is valid, getting the pipeline runs. So what that is doing, maybe if I just go back to the developer area, is we're hitting the Azure Management API and we're saying that we want to pass in a filter which we're going to drive from our properties table of within a given pipeline runs window, do we have a pipeline running? And then we've got some filtering happening in here that says yes, I want to exclude the run ID if that's indeed passed to it, if we're using this as a call from something else, and then check if we do have a run happening, report that back and filter that down, filter those results down to determine that yes, there is already an instance of this pipeline running, of course itself in this case, but when this is wrapped up in the framework, it will be checking if the parent pipeline is running. So we see in the filtered results, or the get parents, the get pipeline runs is currently everything that's been running in my environment. But the filtered runs is, yes, we do have one in progress, and that one is the value that we then use later on in the pipeline to determine, well, if we have a running instance of this pipeline already in progress or queued, then throw an exception using that throw exception utility that I showed you. So that's a utility pipeline. You can see then within the parent that this sits at the very start of the parent pipeline. So as soon as that parent pipeline is triggered, it will look at the pipeline runs. If it's already running, it will stop, it will throw that exception, it will cause that failure, and then the pipeline doesn't carry on. It means that Data Factory is then no longer reliant on the current execution table to understand if there's already a processing framework run that is already happening. So it'll do that first. And once this is wrapped up in the parent pipeline, you can see the parameters that are being passed to it is the parent pipeline name itself using that system variable, and also its own run ID. So it can then exclude that new run ID from the results set when it's doing that filtering. So that was a nice addition, say feedback from the community. Next up, let's take a look at 71. So this is a very quick one. So just separating out the metadata integrity checks and the cleanup processes. So if you're familiar, we have this for each activity here, which is doing a cleanup of the previous runs in the framework. So if there's been a wider platform failure, we want to leave the metadata in a controlled state. But if that's not the case, it will try and do a cleanup. Now, the activity preceding the for each in previous versions was the check metadata activity. And that store procedure, it had a very specific purpose to, as it says, check the metadata. But I ended up in the previous version was tacking on sort of a secondary function in that store procedure to go and inspect the current execution table and return information to support that cleanup. Now that made sense perhaps at the time, but then of course as things have grown, now it makes more sense to separate out those two store procedures. One, which of course is the true metadata integrity checks, and now that lookup to establish if a cleanup routine is required, we can do that separately. So now we have two store procedures, two activities ahead of that cleanup operation, just for neatness really, and easier to then control what we do next. So that's an easy one. Next, we have capturing the last pipeline parameter value. This was, again, another sort of recommendation instigated by the community. So if I just turn my attention to Management Studio here and in the database, what you'll see is the pipeline parameters table. And this now has this new attribute, the parameter value last used. So you can see that in the results set. I don't think I've got any data in this one, but what will happen now is using the store procedure get pipeline parameters, so the one that's called in the infant, what's now happening is that when we get a pipeline parameter or a set of pipeline parameters for our worker, it will then go and put those parameter values back into the table, into that last value used column. So the thinking there is that what people can do is, if they've got lots of time series data, when they're passing parameters to their worker pipelines, which was a very common thing that you'll do, what we can do in, sorry, not in the infant, in the parent, we could use that last parameter passed value in conjunction with our execution precursor procedure, which of course is the custom code that is going to run before anything else. And we could inspect that last value used to then determine what the next value to be used is for the next execution run. So that's the thinking there, and hopefully that extra combined with that precursor might help you with your behaviors on a given execution run. Okay, next up we have validating our worker pipeline name. So this was a kind of an interesting one, and an error that I stumbled across really on my own and with some other customer instances of the processing framework. So within the infant pipeline, there was a couple of occasions where I'd received an error, and that error had come from the execute worker function. And the error message, it was a little bit cryptic, it wasn't very helpful, but ultimately what had happened was that at the point of hitting that execute pipeline function, the worker that I was trying to call, it didn't exist. Two main reasons it didn't exist. Number one was the metadata that had been entered in the pipelines table was wrong. So of course, when the function tried to hit that pipeline, it wasn't there. There's basically a typo in the name. And then the second instance was that the worker pipeline we were wanting to call, it had been developed in Data Factory, but of course it hadn't been published. So it's of course the published worker that we're using. Now, in both cases, the error that we got back at this point in the infant wasn't very friendly, wasn't very informative. So what's now been added before that happens is this validation function. So we have a fifth Azure function now that's used as part of the processing framework. And what the function will do is, if I show you and jump into Visual Studio, go away tests. If we look at the C# that's in here, we are using the Data Factory management client. We are getting a list of pipelines, or pipeline in this case, using the resource group, factory name, pipeline name. And that pipeline resource class is then returning us some information. Now, of course, if the pipeline does exist in our target worker data factory, we will get a result and everything is happy and nice. If we don't get a result, we get an exception. And the point really here is within the function, I want to catch that exception, effectively swallow it, and then report back to the framework a more useful and more informative, this pipeline that you're trying to call, it doesn't exist basically. So we get a false status back. And then what we can do is within the context of the infant, we can use that function output and say, okay, we've got a false status reported. Now, instead of an exception being thrown in the function, we can then just handle that output in data factory, not with the true status, with the false status, and then we can throw our own exception. But of course, we can do it in a much more controlled way that then reports back to the metadata that actually the reason we couldn't call this worker pipeline is because at validation time, we found out that that worker, for whatever reason, isn't in the target data factory that we expect. Now, that then updates our current execution table with some better information. And what I've then also added to try and sort of accompany that and complete the story, let's assume that it is a typo in that metadata, because of course at the point of that happening, the idea would be that it's the current execution table that's being used and that pipeline name from that table. So if we hit restart, we're just going to encounter the same problem. So what has been added as well, as I say, to try and sort of help and support this within the metadata integrity checks procedure, if we encounter it, let's just scroll down here. Yeah, this one. So if in the current execution table we get this invalid pipeline name error, which is what that validation function is going to report back, the framework will try and help us. So on restart, the metadata integrity checks procedure will look at that current execution table. Let's assume we fixed the typo in our pipelines table. It will then just try and do that update for us. So if you've got a typo, we'll now get a validation which can control the framework, and then we fix the typo, we restart, and the store procedure will update the metadata for us. So on restart, we hopefully then succeed and that validation step passes. So that is that one. And then last but not least, within my done column here, perhaps the most exciting thing for this release of the framework is to now extend our executions with this new concept, which I'm calling execution batches. So execution batches will sit as a level above execution stages in our metadata. Now, the best way to perhaps guide you through this is if we just go to procframework.com, which of course you all have as your homepage. And now what we have in the documentation is execution batches and execution stages. So the main sort of thinking here and the main reason for this is to allow the parent pipeline to be called concurrently. So we execute the parent pipeline for batch number 1, as the visuals kind of suggest here. And then what we can do is we can call the parent pipeline again, and we can run it then for batch number 2. So the obvious use case here would be that if you have an hourly process, a half hourly process, a daily process, up until now, the processing framework has meant that actually, those things, they can't really happen within the framework because the framework only expects one set of executions. Now, with this introduction of this concept of batches, we can have, say, batch number 1 running every hour. We can have batch number 2 running daily. And actually those 2 batches could happen concurrently within the framework if we want them to. So that's the idea behind it. What I'll probably do is a follow-up video just to demonstrate the execution batches and what that looks like in our current execution table. But what you'll now find within the metadata is should I say, 3 new tables. The first one being our batches, which I've got some data in, so you can see I've used that example of daily and hourly batches. We then have a batch to execution stage link table. So for my daily batch, I'm going to use execution stages 1 to 4. For my hourly batch, I'm using execution stage 5. But because this is just metadata, and because we can ultimately call data factory pipelines more than once, we could use our batches and our execution stages and by extension our worker pipelines in any combination we want. We could have multiple batches of separate names, both called concurrently, both using the same set of stages and the same set of workers, but maybe we just pass different parameters to them at runtime. So hopefully now that ability to run execution batches within here sort of unlocks a lot of capability that perhaps was missing in the framework before. And what we'll now see is in the parent pipeline, we have a pipeline parameter called batch name. So it's an optional parameter and it's driven by our properties table. So there's a new property in here that says use execution batches, which defaults to 0. So if you don't want to use this, the framework will just carry on working exactly as it's been doing so far. Of course, if you do want to use this, you set the flag to number 1, you enable that feature, you set up your batches, you link them to your execution stages, and then what you can do from the parent is trigger it. Maybe in your trigger, you provide the batch name, if it's hourly or daily or however you want to create your metadata, that's fine. And then what you'll see is within the current execution table, you will see the execution ID, which of course used to just be a unique value for everything. You'll see now multiple execution IDs in there for the different batches. And that gets wrapped up into this batch execution table, which hopefully the structure of it's fairly intuitive. So we have the batch ID and the batch name, which come from our batches table, and then we have that execution ID. And what we'll see in here is that we then have this wrapper, if you like, or this level above our execution stages for these batches that will give us that extra level. We will see a batch with the status of running, of course, if that execution and everything below it is running. We will see a batch with a status of stopped or stopping or also abandoned. So if we wanted to override our restarts, which is a behavior that we've had before, and we have batch executions turned on, we can abandon a batch, create a new batch and carry on. So batch executions, I say that concept and that level now that sits above our execution stages. So do go and check out the documentation for that. Hopefully I've explained it fairly well, but I will do a follow-up video to demonstrate it as well. And then with that, that is my very brief agenda done. So thanks everyone for watching. Hopefully that gives you a quick summary of the features that have been added in version 1.9.2 of the processing framework. Thanks very much. See you soon.